Welcome and thank you for inviting us to this. We're really excited to be here and appreciate all the challenges that everybody has. I'm thankful that I have teenagers because I appreciate the 4-year-olds running around when you're trying to do work. So I've been in the research world for over 25 years in the health research world. And so my background really has been around fundamentally conducting behavioral and clinical research. And as part of that journey, what I wanted to understand is kind of like, how do we actually take the research that we do that's really important and move it beyond peer review publications, which are important, but create a place where kind of we can get that out to the patient, the provider, the other people who really need the information. So that's the world kind of that I come from. And I was lucky enough to meet Kristine when we were actually rebranding our company about 17 years ago. And after that successful rebrand, we got to kind of talking about how research and design really go together. And we began on working on other projects and bringing design into research, research into design. And so that's where I'm going to kick things off today and just really talk about how I think about this as a researcher, and then bring in the story of kind of how research works better through thoughtful design. And I think, I know there are some folks who are familiar with the healthcare background who have research maybe in their background on this session. And so health research, we really actually, because we are committed to this altruistic, humanistic mission to improve health through improving medications or treatments or processes or policies or guidelines or what have you, we're fundamentally driven by this mission that connects us to the people who are impacted by the health challenge, right? Or the question that we're trying to solve. So researchers fundamentally are about finding the truth through developing evidence. And we can't find the truth unless we understand and develop the right research hypothesis. And this is probably familiar to many. But simply put, that means that researchers are taught we can't solve the problem until you have a clear idea or hypothesis, right, for the problem we are trying to solve. And we follow a pretty strict process to accomplish this research objective. So if I can figure out how to share my screen here for a second.
For those of you that are you might want to change the speaker view, to see this is better.
Yeah. So this viewpoint right here is really the way most research studies or clinical trials start. We start with discovery. We identify what is the problem that needs to be solved or the health challenge that we're trying to address. And for instance, whether it's a need for a treatment or determining if 2 treatments work the same or differently, if we identify a gap in care in the clinical process, we have to kind of discover that. And once we understand what that is, we need to define the hypothesis. And that's kind of what is the question that needs to be. And oftentimes it's not just what needs to be answered, but what can be answered, because not everything we want to answer can be answered. And you'll see how that becomes part of this life cycle. And this step number 2 is critical, because if the question or hypothesis is actually wrong, then the answer may be right, but we're solving the wrong problem because we asked the wrong question. But once that's defined, step 3 is really to develop the roadmap. And in our world, it's called the protocol. And this is where the team brings the ideas together to determine how best to address that research question. So what are the tools we're going to use? What's the design? What issues and challenges are we going to have, whether it's through site management or how we're going to recruit patients, things like that. And this is usually based on established methods. It's methods tested against whether they can answer the question that we've defined in step 2. Next, we actually move toward implementation, and this is really where you put that protocol, the roadmap, into action. And this is where we get into recruiting. We initiate the study, and we conduct the research. And you may think, okay, well, then we're done. Great, we did it. But what's really interesting in a research process is that you have to test and analyze whether or not the protocol is right. We do a lot of work to make sure we got it. But once we do that, we put it into the field and we really have to figure out, did all those assumptions that we were making work? And experience helps to prevent those from being way off, but it always needs tweaked. Some sites don't work. Some things we thought were the right measures weren't working. And so we kind of address those recruitment challenges. We do some analyses and we make modifications. And so once we finish that process, we continue to generate data. And you'll kind of notice how the process will start all over again. We start back at discovery to go back and review our primary hypotheses, our primary outcomes, and we define how the analysis plan is going to address those and develop endpoints and all these things. So the process kind of continues, and it leads to this infinity loop of answers that generate new questions, and the cycle starts again. And from a research perspective, this is how we see the world. And so Kristine will kind of share how the designers see the world.
Great, thanks, Lisa.
And let me stop sharing. There we go.
Excellent. So, so Lisa was talking about the research side of things, and I'm going to talk about the design side of things. And so designers are trained, right, or taught that you can't find a solution until you have a clear idea of what the problem is, which, you know, that sounds very similar to kind of things designers think about. So I was trained, I went to RISD in graphic design, and I've spent 27 years in what most people would call marketing communication. So I think that when a lot of people think about marketing communication, they think about things like advertising or promotions or sales or branding. And I think oftentimes researchers are kind of like, yeah, well, that's interesting, but, you know, I don't kind of need that, or that's not what we do. And what I wanted to talk about is a little bit about presenting marketing communications in a little bit of a different light. And so ultimately designers really practice 3 categories of message making. So either we are trying to make messages of value, or we're trying to make messages about value, or we're making messages that have no value. So we would like to avoid, obviously, making messages that don't have value. So to avoid that, we work on, we use a human-centered design thinking process. So I will, you know, share my screen so you'll see that the design thinking process is always human-centered, like research. It starts and ends with the audience you're serving. So in this first phase, and you'll notice that the first 2 phases in design thinking and both in research is that they're very similar, right? Because in the first phase of a design thinking process, we're using empathy to gain understanding and insights about, you know, what is, you know, what's going on, and really it's a problem finding phase. So designers know if you solve the wrong problem, right, you get the wrong answer, and there's nothing worse than that, putting a lot of effort into something that doesn't work. So then once we found the right problems, we move to phase 2, where you define what the problem is. And so you can see that the first 2 phases sound very similar to kind of research. And then this is where it shifts a little bit. So in phase 3, we move to an ideation phase where we are working on exploring the different approaches that can be taken, right? This is where kind of that we connect the problem and the solution, and we have to figure out, you know, what is going to work. And then in phase 4, we start to prototype that solution. And that can take many forms if we're designing mobile tools or materials for patient recruitment. And so this is where we're really kind of bringing something to life and seeing what works, and we're designing some actual kind of product or communication. And then that goes to phase 5, where we're testing that solution. So this is where, again, we're looking to make refinements using an audience. So I think that you can see that this allows the way that designers think is really in alignment with the way researchers think. And this is why it's been an absolute pleasure to work with Lisa and her team over all these years, because we've learned that it really is like chocolate and peanut butter.
And realistically, I think what's important in research is actually all about messaging too. And we don't think in those terms, and we don't talk in those terms. But in fact, if we really, really think about it, the success of prospective research is really about 3 things: bringing people in, which is we must engage the participants, and that addresses their motivation and helps to solve a concern that they have, not necessarily the research question that we have. It has to take advantage of what's important and interesting to them, and has to resonate with them enough to consider participating. So once we do that, we have to keep them engaged. And so the important thing about research is all about the person, right? If there is no participant, there is no study. So keeping people engaged requires that we, number one, respect their participation, because we have to understand that they're doing this for their own altruistic reasons, and we have to respect that. Often too, there are follow-up visits. So sometimes we need them to come back and do something else in a study. So making sure that we're addressing kind of the study from their perspective is really important. And we have to respect the communities that they are in, because all people and all participants are part of communities. And we have to understand that researchers just can't come in, research, and leave. We have to respect that they're part of a broader system. And we also know that we may come back into those communities to research, or we may have other research collaborators that may come back. And so we have to make sure that we're always respecting that when we think about how we are communicating with our study participants. And then I think the third area is that we have to share information back, regardless of whether it's in a peer-reviewed publication, which are important, but whether it's in publications or presentations, whether we're doing it through social media, through policy and guidelines, marketing, whatever it is, we need to share the findings, because that really comes back to the purpose and our mission. We're doing this for a broader purpose, to give back to something to make health better. So, so I think that we're gonna take a look at a couple of examples of what happens when researchers and designers work together, and the different points of view that help to kind of address these things. And one really good example of how this process can add value is an important study that we were working on called around critical limb ischemia. Very important disease that has some really significant outcomes for patients. Yet it was really hard to recruit patients for this study. And so Kristine and I kind of walk you through how coming together on this made a significant difference in how we approach the problem.
So I think that, as we've worked together over the years, I think that one of the things that I found is that, researchers, the language they use really makes sense to them, right? They're using a lot of terms that are scientific and are accurate, right? And I think that what we've really worked on over time and understanding the projects we work together on is thinking again about that audience and how we can reach and connect with them. And Lisa's going to talk a little more about this project.
So having worked with Kristine and her team and this partnership for a while, we put our design hats on and brought our design partners in early, because we understood that the primary challenge was how patients actually understood the primary research concept and what it meant to them. So that was the premise that we kind of started with as researchers, thinking, well, we need to get this other perspective. So everything in the literature and research speaks to critical limb ischemia, peripheral artery disease, and it made sense that the study and the protocol and all the research materials spoke in those terms. But what we found through kind of lay research as we were developing some patient engagement tools was that conversations with members of the research team and also individuals who experienced this condition, we learned the following. Patients don't actually know what critical limb ischemia is. They don't know what peripheral artery disease is. They have never heard these terms, and they didn't know it applied to them. So when we understood that what their concern was really about losing their foot or leg to amputation, we understood that's the point where we need to intersect with what motivates the patients to participate in a study. And understanding this, I think, makes a immeasurable difference in how we communicate what we're trying to accomplish.
So, and I think another example is that we applied for a small business innovation grant from the National Institute of Health. And when you're, writing, when you're kind of writing one of these grant applications, you can imagine that the process is rigorous, and it has, you're talking to scientists and researchers. So it's completely appropriate when you're writing these grants that that's your audience and that's who you're talking to. So we applied for a grant that was, the title is Fourth Trimester, a web-based tool for postpartum care to address the needs of underserved women. So we were fortunate enough to receive this grant. And so I think that, you get into this, even me over time, you start to get into this researcher mode where you're really paying attention to kind of the grant application process and the language you're using. And then when we wanted to make a 2-pager announcing that we had received the grant, we thought, okay, the title is fine, but then we really had to think about how it was written in the grant and how we needed to change that communication if we were going to write a 2-pager more to, kind of general, more announcement. And so that story was different. It was a different order. The language changed. It became more friendly. And then as we worked on the project and we started to think about patient recruitment, this is where language really needs to change, right? It doesn't make sense to start to use language like fourth trimester or postpartum So we changed the language to, are you currently pregnant, or have you recently given birth? The same exact, we're not changing the meaning, right? That is postpartum, and this is the fourth trimester. But if you start to use natural language, are you currently pregnant, or have you recently given birth? You start to use language in a way that's friendly and understandable. And so it's really these shifts that you have to make as you think about the different audiences that you're talking to, as you kind of go from, if it happens to be a grant application, into kind of patient recruitment and bringing people into any kind of research. Thinking about that audience, thinking about how you can stay, all within, kind of IRB approval for the people who know all these research terms. To, if there's any designers, like there's all these kind of very serious approval things about what language you can or can't use. But we're making these shifts to different audiences and realizing that, that's important as we go along in a process.
And so I think what we're illustrating here is that when we bring designers in from the beginning of the process into a research process, all steps in that infinite loop get better. So every part of that process improves. And researchers and designers are both taking a human-centered approach in the work we do. So it doesn't matter if our target audience is an end user, a consumer, whether we call them a participant or a patient or a subject. The terminology doesn't matter, because what matters is that as researchers and designers, we have to recognize that they aren't multiple people. The consumer and the participant are not different people. They're the same person, and they want us to care about them. And so when we come at it from that angle and that perspective, it really makes a difference, because we know we're asking the right research questions, because we're discovering and defining and going through the right process. But we also have to think about who's at the end of that research study, and keeping it human-centered from the beginning.
And I think that once we work on kind of language and communication, and then we can apply visual design on top of that, this is where it really gets powerful, because visual design creates shared meaning. I think we've all seen, there's a lot of descriptions about pandemics now, but now we've seen a lot of different visualizations as well. And I think that, words are really important as you transition, but visuals always create shared meaning in ways that words never will. And so I think that, visualization, once you kind of add that aspect of design into any project, it really becomes, the concepts become that much stronger. So at this time, if that's kind of, the things we wanted to talk about, we wanted to open it up to any questions. We have some other thoughts as well, but we wanted to stop and open up to any questions anyone has.
And you can either write them in the chat and we'll get to them, or just call out, unmute yourself and out yourself. Thank you. I actually do have a question, so I might as well start it off. I'm curious to know if you see these research firms or like health researchers or med tech companies bringing on more people who are just fundamental designers into their firm as they're developing products.
It's a good question. I think that where Lisa and we're not so much coming at it from the product point of view. So I don't know, Lisa, you might know, but the one thing I will say that in design, there's obviously been a huge trend in business kind of business to business design companies like, IBM, where they have purchased and brought in tons and tons of design people. I don't see it so much in the business world in terms of like healthcare and health research. But since we don't work in the product world, I can't speak to that. But Lisa, what is your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's an evolution, and we have seen over the last probably several years this kind of evolution towards bringing that in a little bit more in the process, less on staff and maybe collaboration. And I think part of it is also helping to shift what would be traditionally marketing groups to be more engaged in the kind of research and thinking more mission driven, thinking more upstream. And for us, even for us, when we started this process, we had to kind of demonstrate success. We had to show our clinical trial teams that this could actually help make that engagement better, get to first patient in faster, help the study be better. It wasn't just a given. And so when we were able to do that, our study teams kind of became our biggest advocates. They're like, you need to bring this in because they're going to help you make your studies better. And so we actually became embedded, and now in our proposal processes, we're actually embedded in every grant or bid from the beginning, because they now understand that, and our funders are starting to understand that value too. So it is kind of a shift that has to happen, and a lot of it might start small and by demonstrating success.
Does anyone else have any comments on from the product perspective? Amy?
Well, we do have one private question.
Okay.
So it says, how do non-technical designers manage the technical language of research and maintain their credibility as collaborators?
It's a good question. I think that, there's, as a designer, right, we're always learning. It doesn't matter really what we're working on as designers, because we're learning things all the time. But I think that part of what's great is we come in as the people that don't know, right? So designers are the great people that ask all the really dumb questions as well as the smart questions, like, what is that? What does it mean? And I think that for every project, what's interesting is it's our kind of curiosity and always kind of questioning and in the process of understanding. Because when people from the outside, like designers, come into a research process and start asking questions, researchers right away are like, oh, you don't come from my world and you don't understand this, and so I have to explain that to you. And so right off the bat, the kind of communication and the exchanges we're having start to get the researchers to understand, like, oh, why don't you know this or understand this? So it's not just about you have to definitely come up to speed on whatever if you're talking about critical limb ischemia, you have to know what that is. But I think that through the process, it's really the questioning that we start to understand, and people start to realize, oh, maybe this isn't as clear as what I thought it was.
And I would second that. And I would also say, just remain curious, and also, understand your value in the process, because it can be scary sitting in a room of researchers who talk in languages that you don't understand. But in fact, in the cases that we were giving examples for, and I've known Kristine for a number of years. And so we're talking about critical limb ischemia or postpartum depression. And Kristine, having done the research and knowing, she's like, yeah, wait a second. So critical limb ischemia, what does that mean? And so be able to have value in what you bring to the table, because what you're bringing is that perspective that no one else in the room is going to have. And I can say that from being a researcher who, thinks that I think outside that box a little bit, but I'm often brought up with when Kristine will be like, yeah, stop and explain that, because she knows that there's a whole audience that I'm not quite talking to yet. So always kind of be sure to respect the value that you bring to that conversation, because it is really, really important in making things better.
Did that answer that person's question? Hopefully. Okay. Thanks, Amy.
Yeah. Do you guys have any advice for kind of, if I was a designer and I wanted to start working with researchers, how to go about making that switch, especially as, there's going to be a lot of people in the near future, unfortunately, looking for new employment?
Yes.
Any thoughts on that?
I think, one of the things as a designer, right, we're usually in the case, we're work for hire kind of people. And so researchers, are the ones generally applying. They kind of have the money or the idea, right? And they're coming as a client to us with that. I think that part of that is starting relationships with researchers, starting to talk to them, and starting to work together on where you could come together on, either early in the process when you're applying for something, or how you might intersect. So Lisa, if you want to talk about maybe how we started, from kind of a money point of view, because the part of it is, right, researchers will say, well, there's no money for that in this, there's no money. What are you talking to me for? So Lisa, if you want to talk a little bit more, because the money part needs to come in order for us to be able to obviously do the work.
Yeah, and I think as a designer, being able to, another aspect is being part of a marketing team, that you bring that perspective to the team, right? And so come in it that way too. But Kristine's right. It's not always a given, and research money is really hard to get, and respecting that, it's often a very protective place to be when everybody wants to kind of tag on to your research grant. So the first question is, why do we need that? And what I think we did initially was start small and demonstrate that we're not talking about, we're not going to take $1 million out of your budget. We're going to start small and we're going to do small projects and we're going to demonstrate success. We're going to demonstrate value and then we're going to scale. So I think building those partnerships and those relationships that Kristine was mentioning, and then, not trying to boil the ocean, but really help to bring in kind of small value where you can and build in that skill set, makes it so that future grants, and like I said, we now bake it into every grant we put in, that becomes a process over time.
Yeah, I would say start having the conversations. And I think what's been interesting about, our relationship over time is the small business innovation grant from the NIH around postpartum we applied to it, and Orange Square is the prime on that. So versus the research team. So that's a first for us. And so I think that, for me, it's been this really great journey of doing meaningful work like this. And then kind of coming to the kind of full circle moment where we were the ones applying for the grant and they were the subs instead of us being the subs. So I think that it's all things are possible as you kind of learn and become educated.
This is going slightly off topic, but in this idea of communication and easing that language for researchers, I've always joked about, research publications or any of these just the titles themselves are so hard to understand, let alone the written language. Are we seeing this also, people taking more care on simplifying the language in publications?
No.
Is that more accepted in like science, the publication itself?
I have noticed I've noticed a lot more playfulness in some of the titles of research publications, but honestly, it's kind of a different world, and that's okay. So the answer is probably not, but I think that's okay, because what is starting to change, and thankfully social media has had a really huge impact on that, is that, one of the challenges that in this journey from kind of thinking about research more broadly and how it impacts the actual people we serve in research, it was really about how do you actually get that word back out beyond the peer-reviewed publication is critical to show that it's valid and the research was done really well to the standards that it needs to be done to. So those are critically important in the process, but it shouldn't stop there. And that's the one thing that I could say that we have seen a shift in, is that there's a lot more than the sound bites on the evening news about red wine's good for you, carrots are bad for you, eat more chocolate. Now it's like there's actually substantive, materials out there talking about how these guidelines, policies, and things change your daily lives and impact it. And we're seeing that all over the news now. We're seeing epidemiologists, and they're on the evening news, and no one knew what an epidemiologist was 2 weeks ago. So so I think that's where we're seeing it more, and that's probably the important thing.
And I see Eva Anderson raised her hand. Eva,
is this something that, can I talk to you?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, hi, Kristine. This is Eva Anderson, and I'm a local designer, do graphic design, and I actually work with Kristine from time to time, and really enjoy her thinking and her strategizing around design. And one of the things that I've had the privilege of is to work with a company that does do, they're based in DC, and a lot of their clients are state agencies. But one of the things that we have seen is that with the passing of the Plain Language Act in 2010, and there's been this wave of health literacy. And 20 years ago, when I first started on this journey, no one was really mindful of it. But I think more and more people are seeing the value, and they are starting to come on board to hire people like Kristine. And so I think that you will see more and more of the awareness coming on board. So I think it is happening. I just think, like everything else, it's very slow. And I think that there are more designers coming on board. So definitely I don't know why I said that, but I just was responding to what you had said, you know, just about the you know, the proliferation it's starting to happen.
Yeah, and I think that it's clear because now we have very critical information that needs to be more clearly stated, right? Or better visuals. When something is, you know, as critical as it is right now in terms of communication. So I think that there's so many good examples right now of how things are not being done well and how things are being done better and what that looks like. And I think we're kind of in a time right now where people are starting to not only understand, you know, what public health is and what an epidemiologist is, but that, you know, that when it's critical that people really understand information, how that is offered up in terms of anything to do with your health.
Yeah, and you say it so much more eloquently to me, but I do agree that also the biggest challenge oftentimes is dealing with the people who are actually writing the content are the doctors or the lawyers, and they have their own agendas. You know, the doctors want to they come from a very different position, or the lawyers have their seats that they're coming from, and then you have the policymakers, and the language that they speak is not, you know, as you know, Kristine, the vast majority, you know, 25% I think it is of our population might have a 5th grade reading level. Many people need to get their materials in different languages, and so how do you write for that demographic? And oftentimes they are the ones who are needing the care the most.
Yeah.
Or elderly on meds.
Yep, absolutely. And we're starting to see some of that now.
Thank you both, Kristine and Lisa. It was a great, you know, discussion about the collaboration that you're forming.
Thanks for having us, Avi.
And you've been
everyone's doing a great job at all of the good ventures you guys are creating online. It's really fun.